slide is this House believes a nuclear Iran is better than war. To open for the proposition, we have Sir Richard Dalton, a former senior diplomat who's been posted in Lebanon, Jordan and New York. He's formerly the ambassador to the Palestinian Authority, to Libya, and was the ambassador to Iran from 2003 to 2006. He's now an associate fellow on the Middle East and North Africa programme at Chatham House. So Sir Richard, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. The last time I was in this room was for a debate on the legalization of marijuana in 1968. So not much has changed. In that time, of course, Iran has grown in significance as a regional power. The issue before this House is about its nuclear program. But let's not forget that it has a sense of mission in the world. It sees the survival of the revolution as a God-given necessity, and they see themselves as the vanguard of justice and freedom for oppressed peoples. The most precious value they have is the safeguarding of that revolution. And that is what makes them cautious about how they exercise their power, and it puts them primarily in a defensive position. Now, do you want another war in the Middle East, another war with unpredictable outcome? No. Do you want an Iran with nuclear weapons, thereby breaking a great hole in the defenses against proliferation of nuclear weapons, not just in the region, but by weakening the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty elsewhere in the world? Answer, no. So it would seem that we have a major problem. And we do. It occupied 3 years of my time in Tehran. We presented a major proposal for negotiations to the Iranians in 2005, which they rejected, and the situation has not moved on. So should we be panicky? Answer, no. And I'll try to explain the rest of the time I've got why I think that caution in our responses, relying still on diplomacy while reserving the military option, is the right approach. Is there going to be a nuclear Iran? Answer, we don't know. Language like Iran is hell-bent on developing a nuclear weapon is misplaced if you look at the history. When I researched long-range security issues in the Persian Gulf in 1992, the prevailing wisdom was that Iran would get that nuclear weapon by 2000. It hasn't because of the technical difficulty, and more recently, it hasn't because of the sanctions which have impeded its development of sufficient enrichment capacity and various other technical issues. Moreover, the power of negotiation has not been tested because of the unimaginative, stilted, frankly constipated approach of the Obama administration in pretty well continuing the Bush policy of not engaging Iran on the strategic issues that are of concern to Iran as well as the United States. So it's wrong to assume the worst. That's my message. But let's say Iran is actually lying, that it can solve these technical issues, that it will enrich to the higher levels necessary for fissile material in defiance of its obligations of the inspection of its facilities, and UN Security Council prohibitions and so on. And let's say it is not persuaded by the extra sanctions that would undoubtedly be heaped on it if anybody got a suspicion that it had crossed the threshold of starting to enrich to the higher level required for fissile material. Well, the advocates of war would say, clearly that's the thing we've got to do. But I believe they, one, exaggerate the danger, especially to Israel. Why? Because they deny the rationality of the Iranians, that primarily defensive posture which I was referring to. Secondly, they grossly underestimate the damage that war would cause, particularly to the Green Movement. We know from countless quotations by the people who are struggling for freedom in Iran, as people are in the Arab world to this day, that they don't want war. They think it would be the worst possible option. And they don't want to say that. They don't say that because they want the mullahs, whom they detest, to have a nuclear weapon. They say it because it would be the end of that movement for freedom and democracy. Thirdly, advocates of war underestimate what Iran would do. In fact, frankly, they underestimate Iran. They tend to think that it can be swatted, whereas in fact, you would get massive retaliation, you would get recreation of the Iranian nuclear programs that had been damaged, not destroyed totally, I believe, damaged in war. The people who know how to do it would not have been killed, and the Iranians would recover. Some experts say 3 years, some say 5. But the point is, you'd have to go to war again, because that first attack would guarantee that the ambiguity in what the Iranians were trying to do had gone, and that they were actually seeking to apply deterrence through having the ultimate weapon. Fourth, they brush aside, the advocates of war, international law. Now, we know where that ended us up in Iraq. Sometimes they define the red line that they believe should be crossed before war. They say, perhaps, well, it's a specific capability. Once upon a time, it was the capability to enrich, but that went by. Some say it's the start of weaponization. Who knows? They are very seldom precise. But the point is that under international law, there doesn't have to just be a capability for it to be legal to attack somebody. You have to have a credible, imminent threat. Now, clearly where a nuclear weapon is involved, international lawyers and the international community generally would cut some slack to the person who felt that they might one day be targeted by that weapon. But there is no evidence of an Iranian willingness to use a nuclear weapon. There is no evidence that they are suicidal. Quite the contrary. Having worked with them for 5 years, and I go back to what I said at the beginning, I believe that the God-given duty to preserve the revolution is the most sacred value, and consequently, suicide equals finito. How can you work in the world anymore? They know that the consequences of first use of a nuclear weapon would be obliteration. And that feature of international law, which is, I believe, so important in this matter, is vital in all manner of other contexts. We ignore it at our peril, and if we again, as the West, while claiming such value to our civilization and to our adherence to law, brush it aside once more, we can't expect others to adhere to it, and we'll end up being threatened unnecessarily ourselves. So my final point, Iran is deterrable. So should all the international inspection mechanisms, all the negotiations which I hope will take place, all the sanctions which would be heaped on Iran if weaponization was detected, should all that fail, then infinitely the better choice is deterrence, mutually assured destruction. The American umbrella already exists. It's relied upon by states in the region. It might have to be formalized to a greater extent. It would be highly regrettable, but it would be a great deal better for the region and the world and for us than going to war again preemptively in defiance of international law. So, war won't work. War increases the danger to the world, and therefore I urge you to support the motion. Thank you.
Richard. To open for the opposition, we have Professor Mervyn Frost, who is the head of the Department of War Studies at King College London. He is currently on the editorial boards of the International Political Sociology and the Journal of International Political Theory. He serves on the executive committee of the International Studies Association and until recently was the chairman of his international ethics section. So Professor Frost, thank you very much.
Chair, thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. My strategy will be to start talking about this in a way that might suggest I'm supporting the previous speaker, but wait for the end. I'm talking about the ethics of the matter, and when considering this proposition, it seems to me that the proposition is analogous to the following one. This House prefers a rock to a hard place. As you can see, that's a real difficult question. And I think we need to do some unpicking before we can simply say pro-nuclear or pro-war. It's not quite as easy as that. Some obvious things. Actors in international relations are not entitled to use force at will. This is true of individuals and states. The fact that we have the Chilcot inquiry going on right now indicates that this country, for example, has an interest in the ethics of this war which we found ourselves in. We see this kind of ethical scrutiny going on with regard to a whole lot of wars in the recent past: Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Sierra Leone, and others. There are ongoing debates about this. Is it right to go to war from an ethical point of view? Now, a state doesn't do the ethical thing by simply raising a banner, saying some good ethical words, and then thinking what it does is ethical. What you do has to be ethical. It's not what you say you're doing that makes it ethical. Now, in the first place, actors in international relations have to stick to a set of really very well-known rules. The rules of the just war tradition are quite embedded in international law. We know what they are, and so do states. Roughly speaking, as the previous speaker said, states may go to war against aggression. Aggression, there's some fine points, but the basic point is that you're only entitled to go to war against aggression. So, what's the story with regard to nuclear arms? Is there a prohibition on owning nuclear arms or trying to get nuclear arms? And the international law is unequivocal. There's no legal impediment to that. So I have to start somewhere else to make my case. And the other place I want to start is that in the practice of states today, it is widely accepted that advancing the cause of non-proliferation is a good thing. In other words, proliferation of nuclear weapons is a bad thing. The sentiment has been made real in the International Non-Proliferation Treaty, enacted on the 5th of March in 1970 and signed by 189 states. There are 193 states. So the vast bulk of states think it's a bad thing. And the vast bulk of states think that we ought to be doing everything we can to prevent other states gaining these weapons. So there's widespread agreement on the target of preventing this kind of armament. So the question then is, what may we ethically do to prevent the spread of armaments? And might it sometimes be necessary to use force to prevent another state acquiring those weapons? Here are some arguments to consider, and I have to trot through them because I have very little time left. 7 minutes and 30 seconds. 1, the proliferation argument. If one state gets a nuclear weapon in the Middle East, if Iran gets it, then some other states will be obliged. They will feel in honor bound to get them. Saudi Arabia and Egypt are the ones that are most often suggested. Second argument, nuclear weapons would make Iran an existential threat to Israel. If Iran got a nuclear weapon, it would suddenly walk taller against Israel, whom it suspects, I think quite accurately, of having several nuclear weapons in hand. And this would then inspire Iran to feel strong and to give added support to Hamas and Hezbollah. 3, the possession of the weapon would make it feel strong and lead it to cope with internal unrest by engaging in foreign ventures. So it would block democratization. 4, in the rivalry between Shias and Sunni, suddenly the acquisition of one of the states with a nuclear weapon would destabilize the whole situation once again, and we know what that can lead to. The cause of Islamic fundamentalism might be given a boost by this event. And 6thly, the acquisition would in all probability work against the democratic revolutions that we now see taking place. And finally, 7thly, the expansion of the nuclear club is not likely to promote international stability in the region. Just imagine, Iran gets one, Egypt gets one, Saudi gets one. No, sir, I am very busy and I have exactly 5 minutes and 28 to go. Sorry, please sit. Taken together, these arguments can be seen to be arguments against and anti-proliferation. And I'm sure most of you wouldn't actually advise one state, one nuke, or something like that. That really wouldn't be very good. So, the question is, what can be done about it? Consider tonight's motion changed just slightly. A nuclear Zimbabwe is preferable to war. And then you can go through others like a nuclear Georgia, a nuclear Sudan, a nuclear Libya, a nuclear Nigeria, and so on is preferable to war. Clearly, we wouldn't like any of these so-called, well, what can one say, not fully ethical states to get nuclear weapons. At the base, it could be said that if these states were to get nuclear weapons, this wouldn't be a step towards securing the core values of the practice of states. The practice of states is one in which each state is accorded sovereignty, accorded a domain of freedom, and by doing that we create a world in which a diverse range of lifestyles can flourish together. So freedom and diversity are the core values. Were these states that I've listed there to get nuclear weapons, the likelihood of advancing those values would diminish. So, what am I recommending? I'm asking that we consider the possibility of actions of a forceful kind that are short of all-out war. I'm not making a case for let's declare war on Iran. I'm making a case for the kind of intervention that might include strategic surgical strikes, that might include assassination of scientists, which is taking place already, that might include the use of things like the Stuxnet worm, which is a kind of intervention. It's a kind of a violent attack on the infrastructure of the state, which has not been seen on that scale as we recently saw, and so on. So, I'm suggesting that under certain circumstances, to stop proliferation, we might consider this kind of surgical strike. So, you know, Petraeus invented that word, the surge. I want to suggest we think about the surgical, which might be an alternative. So, who could undertake such actions? And here's a qualification I really want to put a lot of weight on. It wouldn't be appropriate for a single state like Israel to do something like that. It wouldn't have the authority. It wouldn't be appropriate for Britain or the United States singly to do that. The only organization that could grant authority for this kind of act against non-proliferate in order to avoid the proliferation would be the United Nations or a group of states in the region. So in other words, it's absolutely imperative that you have the right legitimacy between that kind of action. If you fail to have that kind of legitimacy, these kind of surgical strikes that I'm suggesting would have exactly the contrary effect to what you want. Instead of halting proliferation, they might then give an impetus to it. So I'm suggesting, in closing, that we make a case for using this type of instrument in certain circumstances if you can build up the necessary kind of authority and consensus on a wide scale in our global practice of sovereign states. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you, Professor Frost. To continue for the proposition, we have Michael Smith, who is the award-winning investigative journalist who broke the story of the Downing Street Memos in 2005. He writes for the Sunday Times and the New Statesman on defence issues and has reported from Iraq, Kosovo and Afghanistan. So, Michael, thank you very much.
This is a very timely debate, of course. Events in Libya and Tunisia and Egypt, particularly in Libya, have shown us that while ordinary Arabs across the Middle East want to get rid of dictators, what they do not want is foreign intervention. What they want is to be able to make the decisions for themselves. Now, that's sometimes a flawed process. The likelihood is always that one strong man, now weak, will be replaced by another strong man. The term interim leader in the Middle East tends to mean I'm going to be around for maybe 30, perhaps 40 years or so. It's not going to be easy. None of this is going to be easy. Libya's case, they might want the introduction of democracy. There's no clear position that they are going to get it. There's no guarantee in any way that they're going to get it. The likelihood is that we will see another strong man in Libya. If we were to intervene in Libya, we would, and it's very clear from what the Libyan rebels have said, we would unite the Libyan people against us. We would ensure that a process that would otherwise take a few weeks would drag on for years. But this would be as nothing compared to the results of intervention in Iran. We might look at it from our perception, and we always do in the West. We look at things from the way we see it and the way we think and the way our society works. We might look at it with a very honest view that the intervention was a move to stop the Iranian Ayatollahs getting a nuclear weapon that they could use to take out Israel. And no doubt, as we did so successfully in Iraq and Afghanistan, between which Iran is sandwiched, we will also paint our attack as an attempt to bring real democracy to Iran and to give the ordinary people the leader they really want. The leaders of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states will no doubt be very happy to see the US intervene to stop a nuclear Iran. Not so happy, of course, to see the US intervene to bring more democracy to the Middle East. The great flaw in all this thinking that this is what we've got to do if Iran gets a nuclear bomb is that our view, our perception, whatever it is not going to be shared by the Muslims, vast majority of the Muslims of the world. Oddly enough, arguments about getting rid of weapons of mass destruction and bringing real democracy to the Middle East don't actually cut it anymore, if they ever did. Not with a vast majority of Muslims. And they get a vote because there's 1.5 billion of them in the world. A fifth of the world's population are Muslims. And actually 72 million of them live in Iran. It's worth thinking about the fact that there are only 31 million people. To be fair, 72 million Iranians, they're not all Muslims, of course. There are only 31 million people in Iraq. Now, if the US armed forces, undoubtedly the world's most powerful armed forces, get tied down for so long, 8 years in Iraq, how much longer in Iran? Because there is no hope of an easy victory in Iran. One thing's for sure, the vast majority of that 72 million people will not share our perception of why we're in there, particularly given that Israel is sat there with nuclear weapons pointed largely at Iran. We here in the West might see President Ahmadinejad as a complete idiot, a fool, an ignorant man prepared to say anything at all to wind up Israel and the West. We might see Iran as a country where cruelty and abuse of human rights are disguised as religious fervour. We might see Iran as a country where many people share our view and have been prepared quite clearly to put their lives at risk on the street to demonstrate it. But if that's the way we're seeing Iran, we are seeing only a very, very, very distorted view of Iran, and one that actually bears very little resemblance to the truth. The people protesting are part of a liberal, middle-class, urban elite, a tiny minority of Iran's 72 million people. They are not, definitely not, representative of the Iranian people as a whole. The vast majority of Iran's population lives in rural areas, and these people are actually glad that their country is going to be able to defend itself against Israel. Why shouldn't they be? They're actually glad that they've got a leader who's prepared to stand up to the American president. Hey, why shouldn't they be? There's no shortage of Iranian voters prepared to burn the stars and stripes and chant death to the great Satan in front of television cameras. These people voted Ahmadinejad into power with 63% of the popular vote in the June 2009 presidential elections. 25 million votes compared to the 13 million votes of the reformist candidate Mir Hussein Mousavi. Unless anyone thinks this is a fraudulent election. Well, you think you're right there, do you? Let me make it clear. Western intelligence believed that Ahmadinejad would get much more, but the independent polling that went before, truly independent polling that went before the elections and after it, came up with similar results. Iran doesn't need our help to get democracy. It already has it, and given the option of a vote between Mir Hussein Mousavi and Ahmadinejad, for whatever reasons, they made very clear what they wanted. That's not all, because in April 2006, President George W. Bush called together his military advisors. He was very worried about Iran and the situation in Iran. He wanted to find out what they could do, what sort of attack could they make on Iran to get rid of these nuclear weapons that they were clearly building. And I, incidentally, don't take the view that Iran is just building peaceful nuclear facilities. I absolutely believe that their aim ultimately is the nuclear weapon, because Israel has a nuclear weapon. They want a nuclear weapon, I don't doubt that. What do we do about it? The US defense chiefs made very clear that an attack on Iran would only serve to forge the Iranian people together and make them back their leadership. Airstrikes alone would not be sufficient. And this is a fact, it's not. This is something, Mervyn, I'm sure will agree with me, it's a fact. Airstrikes alone will not be sufficient to get rid of the Iranian nuclear program. It would need a land intervention, and that would almost certainly prove disastrous. Not only would the attack be resisted immediately by 500,000 Iranian armed forces, who include 125,000 religiously fervent pro-regime Islamic Revolutionary Guards. The bulk of the population, and this is the US defense chiefs, it's not me, it's the US defense chiefs, the bulk of the population would unite against the invaders. Bob Gates, the US defense secretary, who's on record as saying that any future defense secretary who advises the president to send another US army into Asia or the Middle East should have his head examined. He's right. Iran has the capability not just to tie down any invading troops, but to launch a wave of terror attacks across the Middle East and into Europe that would make Al-Qaeda look like restrained amateurs. What of Europe? Which European countries would join this? Certainly not France or Germany, both of whom have dubious histories when it comes to giving the regime in Tehran the initial help and equipment it needed for its nuclear program. What of us, denounced by the Ayatollahs, with a good deal of logic and humour as the little Satan? Given the recent defence cuts, I think they should probably downgrade us to the very tiny Satan. But nevertheless, it's not how we're seen by the majority of Iranians. There's a popular Iranian novel turned into a television series called My Uncle Napoleon. My Uncle Napoleon is an egotistical, obsessive neurotic, a former soldier who makes grandiose claims about his war record and is obsessed with the idea that the British are out to get him because he outwitted them in the past. Everything that goes wrong or appears to go wrong for Uncle Napoleon is blamed on the British. He's not alone. It's a popular belief in Iran that the British are behind everything bad that happens. Given the way we fought with the Russians in the 19th century for control of Iran, in what is still known as the Great Game, this is hardly surprising. Many Iranians believe that when Mohammad Mossadegh was overthrown in 1953, it was the British pulling the strings and the CIA paying the money. And that's absolutely true. The British were the main players there. We weren't interested in the ordinary Iranian people having democracy then, so why should anyone believe we're interested now? But back to the nuclear front. It would surely be far better to allow Iran to acquire a nuclear capability, knowing, as North Korea also knows, that if it were ever to consider using nuclear weapons first, it would have no chance of survival. Starting a war with Iran in order to put an end to Iran's nuclear weapons program would only make things worse. It would force the Iranian leaders' backs against the wall with completely unpredictable consequences, all of them very, very bad. Any invasion would only bind Ahmadinejad's regime and the people of Iran tighter together. It would be an absolute disaster. And as Bob Gates said, anyone suggesting it should have their head examined.
Thank you, Michael. To continue for the opposition, we have Dr. Alan Mendoza, who is the co-founder and executive director of the Henry Jackson Society. He's an acclaimed speaker on topics of foreign policy, particularly concerning the transatlantic relationship, the Middle East, and Russia. So, Dr. Mendoza, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Madam President. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I think I've detected the theme that's emerging on the other side tonight, and that theme is marijuana. The first speaker mentioned it. The second speaker's clearly been smoking it. I have to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, rarely have I seen such terrible arguments to kind of come into this union and try and persuade you on many fronts. Let's just take some of the ridiculous points we've heard before us tonight. The first speaker, Sir Richard, acclaimed diplomat that you are, you talk of the rationality of the Iranians. Have you studied Iranian theology recently? You will, of course, know, if you do, that the Iranians are not rational in their religious beliefs in those terms. They are, in fact, millenarian Shiites, which divert from established studies in Qom and Karbala and Najaf, and instead you have a school in Qom which believes in rule by jurists, which is basically rule by whoever's in charge, who's made it up in that sense. It's entirely a different Shia school to what happens in Iraq. It's an entirely different Shia school to many other branches. And the belief is, of course, multifaceted. There are lots of talk of martyrdom. There is talk about the return of the hidden imam. All these issues come to the fore quite regularly in Iranian political life. Recently, the commander of the army spoke of martyrdom and how he wished to be a martyr and bring the armies of Iran into the fray in that way. We've heard Ahmadinejad himself muse that maybe he has to widen the paths of Tehran to allow for the return of the imam in this way. It's not very rational, is it, Sir Richard, really, in this term? You may.
Is that substantially different from the views of many evangelical Americans who believe in the last days?
Shameful, a shameful comment, sir, because, I'll tell you, it's a shameful comment, sir, Because evangelical Americans are not threatening to wipe other countries on this earth off the face of this earth, as the Iranians have done to Israel. And that's why it's a shameful comment. Now, let's look at several other points that were made. No, hold on, I must continue, please. We may take you in a moment. Now, let's look at some of the arguments from the second speaker. Now, they don't want foreign intervention. Says who? Says you? Well, okay, I've been speaking on Skype to people in Libya, Iran and Benghazi who do want foreign intervention, so it's difference of opinion there. I think the ones being shelled by Gaddafi, for example, are in a better position to take that than you in London from that point of view. Secondly, yes, this was my favourite. The Muslims won't like it. This was a very, very bright point, because obviously you haven't read WikiLeaks, have you, sir? Because if you did, you'll have noted, for example, the Saudi king begged the Americans to crush the head of the snake being Iran. There have been many examples of such like of diplomats and others, and people explaining, which also goes to the Sunni-Shia split in the Middle East. It's a very complicated topic, and the notion that all Muslims as a uniform would hate this is absolute nonsense. Oh, go on.
Say that Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states would back it, and I have no doubt that they will.
You said 1.2 billion Muslims wouldn't back it, and there's your point.
5 billion Muslims.
Even worse.
No, I said the vast majority of Muslims would not back it, and they won't.
Well, once again, sir, this is your conjecture, and I think, as that point makes clear, it is a far more complicated topic than that sweeping statement would suggest. But let's move to our argument, to go back to this point, because we have, of course, the motion before us about this House would rather a nuclear Iran than war with Iran. Now, let's get one thing clear. No one on this side wants war with Iran. All of the people on this side would agree with Sir Richard that we want to exhaust every possibility, diplomatically, in terms of sanctions, in terms of covert action, whatever we might do to stop this from happening. We're not talking about war with Iran today. We're talking about war with Iran if we're at the 5 minutes to midnight point and all other options have been exhausted. I mean, there is an argument suggesting we may already be at war. As our first speaker already mentioned, there has been a sort of ramping up, a surging up of the surgical actions, the Stuxnet, for example, various targeted assassinations. Well, someone's clearly at war with Iran if we're already bumping off some of their citizens and launching cyber warfare against them. So there is an undeclared state of war already. But let's look at some of the arguments in terms of the issues of containment. And the key argument on that side is, don't worry, if Iran goes nuclear, it's going to be okay, we can deter and contain them. Well, I'm sorry, once again, this is based on your conjecture. You've talked about the rationality, we've argued that. You've talked about what may happen, mutually assured destruction. But there are many problems with containment. It's not really as simple as saying, don't worry, we've got nuclear weapons, we'll be able to sort them out. Now, firstly, we don't know what will happen if Iran gets nuclear weapons. It's an unknown. We do now have some of the statements they've made and the type of regime that they are. We do know that they have threatened other nations in the area, wiping off the map. We do know that they fund, actively so, international terrorism in the form of Hezbollah and increasingly Hamas. So we know they're capable of doing these things. We know that they also subvert, hang on one second, I'll take you in a moment, that they also subvert neighbours, and they've intervened in Iraq. They've intervened in Afghanistan, as has been made clear by American and British commanders who've encountered either Iranian arms or indeed Iranian support for such measures. Did you want to come back on that?
Yes, I wanted to clarify what you said by capable, because I would contest that they are not capable of using a nuclear weapon against Israel. They might be capable of threatening Israel, but there's a distinction there.
Well, okay, but at the moment that's an unknown, as we've all discussed. But the point is, we have to go on some kind of past behaviour, past form. When someone says they're going to do something, it's reasonable and sensible to assume they might well do it. And that's a point of this argument. Now, let's continue with the points about containment. What's wrong, firstly, with a nuclear Iran? Well, we're going to argue quickly on two specific points. Firstly, a nuclear Iran will undoubtedly lead to a very unstable Middle East. Yes, we have the undeclared Israeli capacity there, but when states develop nuclear weapons quickly, firstly there's a pressure to increase their stockpiles to prevent the possibility of those nuclear weapons being taken out in some way, shape or form. But also, on a secondary point, the systems haven't been built up yet for how you handle nuclear weapons in a region, an unstable region. What's to stop someone, for example, launching by mistake a first strike, by accident, some misperception of what may be coming in terms of intelligence on that side? We must remember the Cold War started with uncertainty on the nuclear front. For many years, until the Cuban Missile Crisis, when, let's not forget, the world was almost destroyed, and that between sort of 20 years into the nuclear discussion between the Americans and the Russians, systems still were not in place to understand and look at how you manage nuclear rivalry. Now, it's not difficult to understand that if Iran became nuclear suddenly, there may be possibility and potential for disaster. Look at the distances involved. If there were to be some kind of military activity, it's far too short a space from, say, Tehran to Tel Aviv. It's not Russia to America, where you've got some time to identify what may emerge at some point. You've got time to identify the threat. If something gets launched in Tehran, the Israelis respond immediately. Equally, if the Israelis do something, the Iranians have to respond. There's no space and no time for any second points. So it's an inherently dangerous situation on that front. Now, secondly, it's quite clear that proliferation in the region would almost certainly follow. In particular, the Saudis would almost certainly develop a nuclear capability very quickly because they themselves were involved in the game of regional influence with the Iranians. And if the Iranians can get away with building a nuclear weapon, why can't the Saudis? Well, very easily. They've got the money to do it, and they've got the links with Pakistan to do it as well. And then you see the problem cascades. Let's imagine for 1 second that Pakistan trades some technology with Saudi Arabia. What does India think about this? Does India suddenly think that Saudi Arabia has allied itself with Pakistan on this nature? Do the Indians now get involved in this? Do other nations in the Middle East start developing this? It's all unnamed, but the point is it's a dangerous and volatile situation. Yes, sir?
India is already a nuclear country. How does that help with proliferation?
It doesn't help with proliferation. Why are you supporting another proliferator? Here's the whole point. Why do you wish to encourage and allow another proliferator to come on scene? I assume everyone here favours the goal of a nuclear-free world. I certainly do. How is this goal going to be achieved if we continue to allow proliferators to proliferate? If we have North Korea, India, Pakistan, and now Iran, and no sign of step, what's going to stop the Saudis, the Turks, anyone else from developing a nuclear capability? Absolutely nothing is the answer. And again, if you look at containment, it's not a simple option. It really is. It's not a question of simply, it's okay, we've got nukes, it's fine. Containment will require a very complicated situation in terms of developing defence schemes in the area. If you look at containment in the Cold War, yes, you of course had the nuclear side, you had hundreds of thousands of US troops in Europe, you had defence budgets far in excess of where they are now. It's forced to say that a war will cost money. Actually, containment over 50 years costs a hell of a lot more money than war does in a very short term. So from that point of view, your cost argument is wrong as well. And indeed, you've got to develop other forms of nuclear capability to always keep ahead of the game. So you've got to keep on building more nukes at a bigger cost to ensure that you're containing the one bad guy in the region. Not to mention the problem of overstretch, which means that if all your focus is on the Middle East, you have problems in other areas of the world. What happens if something happens with China or something happens in Africa? You can't react. So containment is not a simple option. It's a very difficult option and is very problematic to set together. But also, there are 2 or 3 other points to consider as well in this argument about war. Now, firstly, looking at this point, if Iran does develop a nuclear weapon, it's quite likely that countries in the region will indeed flock to the stand in that sense because they'll have been seen to have flouted the international system and gotten away with it once again. We have a duty of credibility here. There is a credibility, I'll take you in a moment, there's a credibility issue here in terms of where we stand and how we wish to look at the international system and international law on those matters. And if Iran can keep on getting away with breaking international law in this way, where does that argue in that point? Yes, sir?
But you're missing the one point, which you guys haven't addressed yet. Would war work? Would it work? Because the first speaker said it wouldn't work within 3 to 5 years the nuclear program would be able to come back.
Well, let me answer you honestly. Let me answer you honestly on this point. They say it wouldn't work. They don't know. We don't know if it would work either. And there's a truth in that. Every operation is risky. You have to look at the capabilities of what you're facing, what you might wish to do in that war, and whether that war is limited in scope or whether you intend to go further, as you know, might be advisable in this case, and go for a notion of regime change. To give an example, the argument here is retaliation would be severe. Well, it might be severe, but actually you could make a case for saying, well, if that's the case, if we know that they're going to retaliate hard, which we assume they would, but there have been times, as you will know, when Iran hasn't retaliated hard in that sense. I shall do so in a moment, sir, but I've come all this way. You'll give me a moment, please. You don't know the answer, basically, to that. So if you think that there's a problem with deterrence, then, with retaliation, then you might want to go a step further and say target leaders for assassination, try and take out the communications nexus of the regime, and work along those ways and see what will happen. I've been told to wind up, so I'm going to wind up in the following way. Look, we've been quoted the Libyan example already. Obviously, that makes sense, resonant here at the moment in terms of bringing Libya up. But I think you draw the wrong analogy from Libya. Really, Libya and Iran are two very similar regimes in terms of the human rights abuses that are committed there, the kind of millenarian tendencies of their leaders to do unusual things at various times, their support for international terrorism. Libya, Iran, it's very similar in that regard. Now, imagine Libya with nukes for one moment. Crazy, but Colonel Gaddafi was developing them. He was getting some way down the path to doing so. Here we have a similar regime that wants to develop these in this way. It's in many ways, it's a more dangerous regime than Libya because of the strength of the system, the 35,000 besieged militia that can be drawn at any one moment to crush opposition at any time in the streets, the mass rapes that occur in prison, shocking tales of young... You think not, sir? You think not? I've got a story here in the Times with a 15-year-old boy raped repeatedly in prison, excrement shoved in his face. Shame on you, sir, for saying no. And one final point, let's finish on one final point. If you think that my arguments are crazy for this 1 minute, for one moment, and that Libya and Iran may have sort of no similarities, I want to point one thing here. I have here in my hand an article that Sir Richard wrote in the Telegraph on Sunday. We must stand ready to intervene in Libya. So Sir Richard wants to go to war with Libya, which doesn't develop nuclear weapons, but he doesn't want to do so in Iran. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. It seems like you're all bursting to make points, and now is your chance. Please keep your speeches to 1 minute long, and when you stand up, state your name and college. Do I have a point in proposition of the motion? Simeon.
Simeon Wallace, Magdalen College. The last speaker for the opposition made the point that the opposition speech was dependent entirely on the assumption that the Iranians are rational enough to not fire a nuclear bomb. He then proceeded to make an argument that was based entirely on the assumption that the Iranians were mad enough to press the red button and fire a nuclear bomb. It's striking that the only thing that separates these two arguments is common sense and a knowledge of history. Also, I found the fact that you accused the gentleman on the proposition of making some sweeping generalisations and then proceeded to base your argument on what struck me as an incredibly reductive reading of Muslim theology and Iranian national politics. My favourite sweeping generalisation was, of course Muslims want intervention in the Middle East. I've been talking to some people on Skype.
Opposition? Yeah, at the back there.
I would like to sort of concede this marijuana thing to say, should Iran nuclear weapons? And I would play, are you high? We're talking about a state where you have a president who, I'm not going to provide a proposition statement here, there is political suppression in Iran. I don't think that man who states that Iran, I'm going to get this right there, Israel should be swiped off the face of the earth, that the Zionists should be pushed back into the sea. This man should not be given 70 megatons of fissile material to play with. Like, we have an Ayatollah who brandishes weapons, who again states that the Zionists do not deserve to exist. An entire nation based on a backward, fundamentalist Islamic view of the world. Not what many Muslims think, again, as Prof. said. I think Iran has the wrong view of Islam. And to say that, like, we should let them have nuclear weapons and not influence them, just stand there, while they make the entire Middle East a hotbed for, like, nuclear war, it's really just absolute madness.
A point in abstention?
This is Yavash. I'm from York University. This is my first time here, and I would like to appreciate this opportunity to point two of gentlemen, Mr. Frost and Mr. Smith? No, Mr. Allen. First of all, I have to ask you a few several questions. Why the war between Shia and Sunni parties has begun since US and UK and other alliances, they attacked Iraq. Before that, we are not seeing those such things in Middle East. Second, who has made Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan? Who has made Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan against Russia? And this Al-Qaeda has made the 11th September, the scenario of the 11th September, which me personally and many other we are not agree with that, 11 September. We are saying that that could be, handmade of US, like what they have did with the Vietnam War. There was a famous story of the US warship in Vietnam. They attacked their own self, their own warship, and then they started the war to Vietnam as a very ridiculous issue. And then you were talking about the Shia and Sunni issues. There is not that much of issues between Shia and Sunnis. Iran is a Muslim country. We do have a minority of Sunni people that are living there, and we do have some people, Sunni people, that are living in the borders. There is not that much of the problems. Unless you guys are trying to put and push some problems and create problems over there, that's a different story. And the last one. And for the UN issue, to me that's a very ridiculous thing, because UN to us means the policies of US, policies of UK, and policies of Israel itself. And being an agent of Israel or those kind of governments, that's a totally different story of being fair to the different nations, because UN cannot defend other nations very fairly. And thank you for your time.
Another point in proposition.
Point of order.
No. Yeah, go on.
This is for our Marians. The second speaker for the opposition spoke about the proliferation of nuclear weapons. But I just wondered who gave the UK or the US the right to say who can and who can't have nuclear weapons, especially if there's no legal justification for it.
Point in opposition. Go on, Albert.
Okay, I'm not going to give my name to the Iranian government. You know what it is, James. Basically, as I suspected, I can sum up the proposition's argument quite succinctly. War is bad, and Iran would not use nuclear weapons, which I wholeheartedly agree with. But what about the other consequences if Iran gets nuclear weapons? Let's take some of the other examples you've used. Comparison with Libya, say, and the effect war would have on the situation in Libya at the moment. So what effect would nuclear weapons have? Well, Gaddafi, being a madman, would probably have nuked Benghazi in the east. In fact, that probably wouldn't have happened because nobody would have tried to protest if they had a nuclear weapon, if they suspected that happening. And okay, the Iranian government might be more rational than Gaddafi. Just an aside, some of the strange beliefs of Iranians I've encountered include that Margaret Thatcher was behind the Iranian Revolution. Yes, blaming Britain for everything. The Green Movement would suffer under nuclear weapons because they'd be fear. They wouldn't be able to come out and protest, and the regime would have full power over them. And I mean, let's look. Okay, it's only the middle class, but the people in the countryside are being paid by the socialist government to support him. Once he's got nuclear weapons and firmly in power, they can do nothing to get rid of him and just have to wait for a reformer like Gorbachev in the Soviet Union.
I think for an abstention. Go for it.
I think that we're kind of missing the point here that most people don't want a nuclear Iran. The problem isn't the war. Nothing would come out of it. It'd be stuck in there for another 10 years. It would be deaths for both sides. There'd just be no point of the war. The nuclear Iran issue is a non-issue. It's just we don't want to go to war. There's no point to that.
Please stop shouting at me, everybody. Proposition, go for it, over there.
On what legal basis would this was the case? Article 2 of the UN Charter Security on the prohibition of use of force. Article 2 only allows the use of force in self-defense. You considered that there was no legal basis and you decided to come up with the reasons for yourself. If anyone is violating the international legal system, then it's you.
A point in opposition. Do you want to put in the back? No? No, go for it.
I think the argument being made by both sides has a slight flaw here, is that we assume that we can have a nuclear Iran without having a war. I distinctly feel from these statements that have come out of Tel Aviv and the fact that pretty much everybody in the Israeli Air Force has a picture of two F-15 fighter jets flying over Auschwitz on their wall, with the idea being, never again will we ever let someone try anything on us before we use force. I've got a feeling that if Israel solemnly believed that Iran was going to get the bomb, Israel would strike first with everything it had, which would involve potentially, I don't think the Israelis would have any problem with nuking the reactor site at Qom if they thought that was what it would take to stop Iran getting the bomb. So I don't think we can choose between the nuclear Iran and war. We can either choose between having a nuclear Iran and a war, or a war and perhaps avoiding a nuclear Iran.
I'd like to give people a chance who haven't spoken before in debate. So, Hugo, last point in abstention.
Ladies and gentlemen, I really, really wish that the position before this House was the options available. That there really was a choice, that there was maybe a nuclear Iran which we maybe could continue to business with, or a war that maybe would work. I entirely agree with the previous speaker that the choices are a war with Iran before it gets a nuclear weapon, which will result in long, malignant, chronic horror all across the globe, versus a war with Iran when it has a nuclear weapon. And I would add which will be too horrible, which will also be too horrible to contemplate. And in the support of that point, I would say that anyone who supports that glib, facile equivocation of Iranian leadership with American evangelicals should blush on the way home tonight. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad belongs to a sect of Shia Islam which is considered so radical that the Ayatollah Khomeini banned it. There are rallies in Tehran where nuclear weapon clouds are considered their symbol. Please be serious, vote in abstention, realize the extent of the pickle we're all in. This is not academic. Thank you.
I think I've had enough shouting at me for one night, so we're going to go back to the main debate. To close for the proposition, we have Professor Scott Lucas, who is Professor of American Studies at Birmingham University and editor of the Journal of American Studies. He's a specialist in British and US foreign policy and has written several books, including Divided We Stand, Britain, the US, and the Suez Crisis. So, Professor Scott Lucas.
Madam Chairman, Madam Chairwoman, speakers, members of the audience. My daddy was a preacher who used to go out on the streets and help fallen people. People in disrepute, people in trouble, people who spoke too fast but came to no conclusion. He called that the Mendoza syndrome. One night, my daddy met a person who was the worse for wear underneath a lamppost, and being the preacher he was, he said, "Can I help you, sir?" And the rather inebriated gentleman says, "Well, I seem to have lost my car keys." And my daddy says, "Well, you know, where exactly did you lose them? Here under this lamppost?" And the fellow said, "Oh, no, I lost them way over there by that tree in the dark." And my dad said, "Well, why are you looking here?" And the drunk fellow said, "Well, the light's better here." You see, I have the feeling that the light has been better here with the false light of saying, let's talk nuclear weapons, let's talk war, when in fact, the issue that is in the dark, but that should not be in the dark, are the rights that are being sought, the justice that is being sought, the basic humanity that is being sought by 75 million Iranians. That to talk of nuclear weapons is not the primary concern for the vast majority of these people. To be told that they will be annihilated, or that some of them may be annihilated, because someone thinks they should not have nuclear weapons is certainly not their priority. Their priority is to live their lives in peace, freedom, and with the basic rights that we enjoy in this chamber. I want to bring that issue out of the dark, but before I do, it is incumbent upon me to deal with the two parts of the motion. It is incumbent to do that because the opposition has not done so. The nuclear issue. I would love to deal in hypotheticals. In my hypothetical world, I'm 6'4", I drive a Ferrari, and my wife wouldn't be nagging me to take the rubbish out. But I don't live in a hypothetical world. First speaker does. All he gave you was hypotheticals. There's not a single fact in that. He doesn't tell you at what stage Iran might be in the nuclear process. He doesn't tell you that the best estimate, which has not been revoked, of American intelligence from the 2007 National Intelligence Estimate is that Iran will not be nuclear capable until 2014-15. He does not tell you about Iranian delivery systems. He does not tell you about the division of opinion between some Iranians who want a nuclear Iran in the sense of civilian nuclear energy capability, some Iranians who want breakout capability to perhaps develop a nuclear weapon but do not want to develop it now or in the foreseeable future, and this madman Ahmadinejad, the only Iranian, by the way, besides the supreme leader, who has been named by the opposition tonight. Let's not talk hypotheticals, let's talk realities. Let's assume that you have someone that has the capability to have 150 nuclear weapons that is not a member of the Non-proliferation Treaty, that by possessing those weapons might encourage others to develop nuclear weapons, that by possessing those weapons might pursue an expansionist policy, that by pursuing those weapons work against stability. Let's not talk hypothetical. Let's talk the reality that that power exists in the Middle East named Israel. Why is the motion not, we should bomb Israel? Okay, if you want to play the democratic Israel argument, I accept that. Let's talk about another power which has been developing nuclear capability, possible breakout capability. Let's talk about Saudi Arabia, which was developing this independent of the Iranian issue before the specter is brought up to you tonight. Why is this motion not, this House would bomb Saudi Arabia? Let's talk realities. When you assassinate scientists, when you say we should assassinate scientists, the Iranian regime stands up and says, Iranian people, you wish to have freedoms, you wish to have justice. We are in a situation where our scientists are being assassinated by the Americans and the Israelis, and those Americans and Israelis are backing the Green Movement. Therefore, we cannot act upon the demands of the Green Movement. In fact, we have to put their leaders in jail, which they've done just this week. We have to put journalists in jail. We have to put lawyers in jail. Because if we don't, more scientists will be assassinated. Let's talk about the realities of the first speaker's argument. Surgical, I'm going to have a word. I'm going to call it surgical. We like surgeons. They're nice. They cure people. That's good, right? That guy on House, that House fella, he limps a bit. He's kind of cranky, but we like him. Why don't we call him preemptive Dr. House? You know, smash up the patient a bit, wham on his head a bit, and then say, maybe that'll cure you. Do you feel better? It's a preemptive strike that was being advocated by the first speaker. The same preemptive strike that was pushed by the Bush administration against Iraq for the years before 2003. The war that he criticized in the opening minute of his speech. Let's talk the war issue. War is not surgical, so what are the rationales for it? Second speaker for the opposition says, well, the Saudi king wants war. Not the Saudi people, the Saudi king wants war. Let's let the Saudi king have his war. The Saudi king, a Sunni Muslim, facing a Shia Muslim system, facing issues of regional power, who says, go ahead, go ahead. You know, rough them up a bit for me. That's it, the Saudi king is behind it. The second speaker says, well, you know what, I'm going to talk about credibility in international law. To be credible in international law, we have to carry out a preemptive strike against a system which is not proven at this point to be a nuclear threat, which is indeed an action which is against international law. Welcome to paradox. Let's talk about the rationale, which is that in fact, Evangelical Christians supposedly don't want to destroy other states, but the opposition does. Point blank, they want the war. And to do it, they will take an organization called the United Nations, set up to avoid war, to resolve conflict peacefully without the use of bombs, and they will pervert that organization to sanction what they're doing. 3 minutes left, though, to come in out of the dark. In the last 20 months, despite all the repressions of a system which has used unjust jailings, which has used torture and abuse, which has stifled journalism, broken down communications, despite all of that, there are Iranians who don't go around talking about millennialism and some hidden imam and crazy systems like that. They talk about security for themselves and their children. They talk about the basic right to vote in an unmanipulated election. And here's the big stinger. To get that, they don't say, to help us out, why don't you come in and use your aerial power on our leaders? Shireen Ebadi, Nobel Prize winner, activist, lawyer. If you use this, if you do this, you will destroy what we are trying to do. People from within the organization. And let me come clean now. I've had the good fortune, because I work with a staff on a website called EA Worldview that has covered the Iran situation day in, day out for the last 20 months. And I have used Skype. It's useful. You know, don't knock it. But I've talked to a lot more Iranians as well. I've got Iranians on my staff. A lot of them can't be named for security reasons. The opposition didn't name any Iranians. To prove their case that Iranians want war, they cited Libyans. You didn't cite Libyans. Yeah, tell me. What?
I'll break up your poor man's Billy Graham.
No, point, not speech, point.
Just 1 second, let me give you the point. The point is, you're saying, firstly, you seem to be disagreeing with your fellow speaker about the relocated election.
Not a point, gone. 41 seconds left. Let's get to it. You didn't debate, sir, you rambled. There's a difference. No. Let's bring this home, folks. You want to talk Iranians and what they want? Talk about Nasrin Sotoudeh, the lawyer who's been put in jail for 11 years for daring to represent other lawyers who are being prosecuted. Talk about Majid Tabakoli, 9 years as a student activist because he called for basic rights. Talk about Mir Hussein Mousavi and Mehdi Karoubi, who are in detention right now. Either in a prison or in a house controlled by the Revolutionary Guard. None of those people have advocated intervention regarding the nuclear issue. In fact, they have advised against it. Poor man's Billy Graham? I'm in the last minute. Poor man's Billy Graham, wrap up. You know what? I don't mind being a poor man. I don't mind being a poor man when we talk about basics here. What I object to is people who don't deal with those issues, who use flammery, who use diverting arguments, who try to tell you that war is peace, and I know exactly who brought that up 60 years ago, and he's still relevant today. You care about what happens in Iran? You care to know what Iranians really think and what they want? Get beyond the nuclear weapon false light. Get beyond the false supposed brilliance of war. Because if you do not, you will leave the important issues in the dark. That is why I must ask you to vote for the proposition. Thank you.
And the entire debate, we have Douglas Murray, a best-selling political author and journalist, famed for his controversial views. In someone else wrote it. In 2007, he assisted in the writing of Towards a Grand Strategy for an Uncertain World. He's been dubbed Britain's only neoconservative and is the director of the Centre for Social Cohesion. So, Douglas, thank you very much.
Thank you for that warm introduction, and it's a great pleasure as always to be back at the Cambridge Union and to be debating alongside my friends, comrades, colleagues, and against such distinguished opponents from the world of British diplomacy, British journalism, and a fine example of current British academia. All three distinguished men in their field, three wise men, they should have come in cloaks. Three men who, between them, demonstrate why Britain is a second, currently slipping to a third-rate world power. Because what you have heard tonight wouldn't stand up to the briefest overview. Sir Richard, distinguished diplomat, said all these years after international negotiations have been going on that the power of negotiation has not been tested. He said that this side underestimates Iran. I can assure you, Sir Richard, we do not. He said that we exaggerate the threat to Israel. Again, I can assure you we do not. He said that in fact, it wasn't Iran that all these years pursuing nuclear technology has been brushing aside international law, but it was this side of the debate. He further said, and I can barely say it with a straight face, so I don't know how he managed, that there is no evidence of an Iranian desire to use the bomb. He then talked, of course, about mutually assured destruction, without mentioning that it, to some people, sounds like a great idea. The regime in Iran has hardly been seriously mentioned tonight. I'm pretty simplistic in the way I would do even the first analysis of a nation. But I tend to think that you can tell quite a lot about a government by two things: what they say and what they do. What they say in Iran has been brushed aside by Sir Richard and his eminent colleagues. It's been brushed aside as it were, a detail that President Ahmadinejad has talked about wiping from the page of history a UN member state, and that the so-called moderate who ran against Ahmadinejad some years ago, Mr. Rafsanjani, said that after all Iran only needed one nuclear bomb to deal with the Israeli problem. They ignored the fact that the supreme leader, Khamenei, has said exactly the same thing. And then what they do, which is that Iran is acting now, as it has been for years, as a regional destabilizer. Destabilizing Syria, destabilizing the Lebanon, funding the terrorist movements of Hezbollah and Hamas, who, not content with expressing their genocidal intent towards Israel and trying to fulfill that desire every day, have also managed to wreck our friends' best chances of democracy in Lebanon. So that's what they say and what they do. The other side this evening seems to think that an Iran with the bomb would be preferable to a war with Iran without the bomb. Regional proliferation in the Middle East is not a small issue. A Middle East, as Dr. Mendoza said, in which everybody had a nuclear bomb, would be a system of détente, which I think we can probably say with some certainty would break down fairly swiftly. But would the Iranian regime I've just described be weaker or stronger once it was a nuclear power? I think we can agree on both sides of the House it would be stronger. Now, would the regime, which has spent again recent weeks, as it did in 2009, rounding up opponents, rounding up, shooting, torturing and raping your fellow students there in Iran, Sir Richard objected to Dr. Mendoza's description of mass rapes. I asked him what mass would be in his opinion. He said millions. I'd love to find out what Her Majesty's diplomatic service's level of toleration of mass rape is. Hundreds, thousands, whatever it is, but it was nonsense to mention it, what is happening to your fellow students. Do you think that the Iranian regime that is doing that is violating and trampling on every right of your contemporaries in Iran, would be weaker or stronger in power once it was also a nuclear power? I think that I think I've had enough. Hardly needs to be raised as a question. Now look, it hasn't come up very much tonight, but it should come up. Israel. This motion that this House would rather have a nuclear Iran than war, and the support I think I've already sensed for our opponents here tonight, suggests to me, and it would to many other people, that we are very grateful that this House doesn't have a say in whether or not Iran will become a nuclear power. And what's more, very grateful that Britain, and I hate to say this in front of a diplomat, but Britain has itself absolutely no way of stopping this. This is a theoretical question raised by theoreticians in an abstract manner because it doesn't matter to you. And perhaps it shouldn't. Perhaps it shouldn't matter at all. But I will not leave this debate tonight without mentioning the people it matters to most, which is the people of the country that successive leaders in Iran have said they will erase from the page of time. Leaders who deny the last Holocaust whilst saying they want the next. I was speaking to a friend of mine just yesterday, whose father was a Holocaust survivor, and he said to his father one thing before he died: what one lesson would you take from the Holocaust? And he said, I take this lesson. When someone says they want to annihilate you, believe them. Don't think they're joking. Don't think they don't mean it. The Israeli people have reason not to want or need you and your opinions on their future. In 1973, when Israel, 6 years after the previous attempt to annihilate it as a state by its neighbours, once again saw its neighbours' armies amassing on the borders, the Israeli government wanted to strike preemptively to stop that war. They didn't. They didn't, among other things, because they knew that if they did strike preemptively, America would not provide them with any munitions. Kissinger said this himself afterwards. So they waited, and they were attacked, as they knew they would be, and they lost many good people. But they were then able to retaliate. They were then able to push those armies out of Israel. But, and this is a crucial thing to remember, the American planes were not allowed to land and refuel, bringing supplies to that country when it was on the brink of being ended, were not allowed to land in any European country, even to refuel. When Israel was about to be ended, you couldn't even stop a plane for a couple of hours on European soil, because the Europeans cared more about the oil deals they were doing with Arabs than they did about the future of that state. Since October 1973, not a single Israeli has thought seriously that when they were about to be annihilated, you or any Europeans would lift a finger, and they knew you wouldn't, and they were right to know you wouldn't, and you wouldn't. When Israel is pushed to the situation it will be pushed to, of having to believe they mean it, and when every bit of jiggery-pokery behind the scenes runs out, and when the UN and distinguished figures have run out of time, and Iran is about to produce its first bomb, Israel will strike. Every single country, including this one, people from our elegant diplomatic service, people from America, everyone will condemn Israel. Everyone in the Middle East will condemn Israel. And they will go back to their homes and they will say in private, thank God for Israel. The Saudis, the Bahrainis, the Egyptians, the Libyans, the Lebanese, everybody will say, thank God they did it, because nobody else would. The proposition being put before you tonight is that you have a choice between war and an Iran with the bomb. You have a choice, as has been said before, between war and dishonor. You'll choose dishonor this evening and you'll get war. You have the choice between a war with a nuclear Iran or a war at some point with an Iran that is not nuclear, which you stop from ever being nuclear, and hope that in stopping that regime, in embedding itself, you will give the Iranian people the best chance they will have of overthrowing that regime. But as I say, thank God this doesn't rely on you or any Europeans, because you've made the same mistake before and nobody should trust you to get it right this time.